Talking wide receiver tiers for the 2025 fantasy football season. This is an exercise I encourage everyone to go through heading into a big draft. Go grab your custom rankings from RotoWire.com, but make your own tiers within those rankings. Players you think have relatively similar outcomes, guys who you're thinking, okay, I'll be fine with anybody within this tier. That's true for the most part, but still order your players within that tier because that will matter if you're on the clock and you're choosing between two or three of those options. But in general, these are all players that we think have a pretty similar range of outcomes. We'll start at the top. We'll run through a bunch of wide receivers here over the next 10 or 15 minutes. Tier one, this is the elite of the elite. These are guys who have all finished as top 2 fantasy receivers earlier in their careers. These are guys who could be easily the number 1 overall fantasy receiver. Ja'Marr Chase, he's got to be number 1 this year. Even if you think there's some level of regression coming after an all-time season, he was the leader in fantasy points among wide receivers in PPR leagues by 90 points, 4 more fantasy points per game than the next best receiver. So again, there could be some regression coming, but unless this Bengals offense takes a big step back, or really unless he gets hurt, it's hard to imagine Ja'Marr Chase not finishing as a top 3 to 5 at worst player at his position. So he's an easy number 1 for me. I have CeeDee Lamb coming in at number 2 over Justin Jefferson, over guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, who we'll talk about in a moment. A healthy Dak Prescott really changes things for this Cowboys offense. And CeeDee Lamb was still fine last season, dealt with some minor injuries of his own. But when Dak Prescott is healthy, he is still, to me, one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the NFL. He's maybe one of the 5 best fantasy quarterbacks in the NFL. List gets even shorter if you're just talking about pure passers. You're not getting running production out of Dak Prescott, but this is a guy who was second in MVP voting, was a top 5 fantasy quarterback 2 years ago. And yes, you could say George Pickens coming to town. Maybe that takes some targets away from CeeDee Lamb. I could see that. But at the same time, I also think there's a case to be made that George Pickens maybe enhances CeeDee Lamb. Like, he has not had a high level number 2 next to him in years, really since he was the number 2 to Amari Cooper earlier in his career. So not too worried about the addition of George Pickens as far as it goes for CeeDee Lamb. My number 3 wide receiver, Justin Jefferson. Maybe you have some concerns about the quarterback. JJ McCarthy has played in 1 preseason game, so I think it's reasonable to temper our expectations there. But Justin Jefferson, to me, is still the most talented receiver in the NFL. If there's anybody that can help JJ McCarthy along in the early going, it's him. Could see Jordan Addison miss some time early in the season. Maybe that's even more volume for Justin Jefferson early on. I mean, we're talking about a guy who has cycled through multiple quarterbacks, and as long as he's healthy, I mean, the baseline is like 1,500 yards. So Ja'Marr Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, your top 3 receivers making up tier 1. All right, so we move on to tier 2, and this is a really interesting tier to me. It wasn't necessarily difficult to pick out the 6 players in this tier, but ordering them, to me, that's a whole different ballgame. And I think a lot of this comes down to personal preference. Are you looking for more of a floor? Are you looking for more of a ceiling? Are you willing to take some risk here? And that's ultimately going to determine how you order these 6 receivers. I went with Amon-Ra St. Brown at the top of the tier. And look, there may be some concerns in Detroit with the absence of Ben Johnson, with some changes on the offensive line. I think if anybody gets hurt by that, maybe it's Jameson Williams. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been healthy. He's been rock solid for multiple years. So I think he's probably the best combination of floor and ceiling within tier 2. We got Malik Neighbors coming in at number 2. We saw him do it with poor quarterback play last season. He may have to repeat that this time around, but not a lot of target competition in New York. Brian Thomas comes in at number 3. And if you're shooting for maximum upside, I think there's a case to be made that Brian Thomas could be number 1 within tier 2. I know Travis Hunter is in the mix in Jacksonville. I know they brought in De'Ami Brown. I'm a little bit lower than market on Travis Hunter, as we'll talk about later. I don't think he's going to have a massive impact offensively in year 1. To me, Brian Thomas still the clear alpha in that offense. What should be a much better offense, by the way, with Liam Cohen now in Jacksonville. Finishing out tier 2, we got Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, and Drake London. I went back and forth on should Drake London be in tier 2? Should be at the top of tier 3? I'm putting him in tier 2. If we're talking about a guy who we could easily be drafting inside the top 8 to 10 picks next year, I think Drake London will be in that conversation. I'm really high on this Atlanta Falcons passing game. Before we get to the rest of the tiers, highly encourage you to head over to RotoWire.com, put in the promo code YouTube15, 15% off any of our subscription options over at RotoWire. We overhauled everything on the site, our rankings, our projections. We got a new logo, a new color scheme. Everything looks great over there. So if you haven't checked it out yet this fantasy season, head over to RotoWire.com, put in that code YouTube15, 15% off anything we offer. We move on to tier 3. We got 5 players in tier 3: AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Ladd McConkey, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Tyreek Hill. So AJ Brown, to me, is he's kind of the Amon-Ra St. Brown of this tier, where you could certainly make the ceiling argument, but the floor I think is what's really appealing with him. We'll see what we get out of that Eagles offense this season. Like I tend to think that maybe we see a bit of a lesser season out of Saquon Barkley. Maybe the passing game wakes up a little bit more. Either way, AJ Brown, always somebody I'm comfortable drafting. Garrett Wilson, he's the only option for the New York Jets. This is one of the weakest pass catching groups in the NFL. Say what you will about Justin Fields, but he has sustained high level receivers before. Usually it's just one pass catcher within that offense, but I think if that's going to be anybody, it will obviously be Garrett Wilson. There's a level of investment there, both in terms of draft capital and the contract the Jets just gave him. So Garrett Wilson now back to being the firm wide receiver one for the New York Jets. Doesn't have to worry about Davante Adams this season. Ladd McConkey at number 3. Not much to say there. Chargers are another team that has a lot of questions beyond McConkey in that pass catching group. You got an okay tight end in Will Dissly. They took a shot on Trey Harris in round 2. We'll see what he turns into. But McConkey, the obvious number 1 receiver in that offense. JSN coming in at number 4. I was the biggest JSN guy last season. Took a little bit, but finally got there. Delivered on the promise that we knew was there based on the talent. All due respect to Cooper Kupp, one of my favorite players in his prime. Not expecting a whole lot out of him this season. The Sam Darnold factor does scare me. We started to see a little bit of regression toward the end of last season. He's now untethered from KOC. Could we see a step back? Yes, it's possible, but I think this will be enough of a high-powered offense to sustain one very good fantasy receiver. So I'm in on JSN, not so much on Cooper Kupp. Number 5 in this tier, it's Tyreek Hill, and just an impossible player for me to evaluate this season. I've taken him in a couple drafts. I've avoided him for the most part. We all recognize the upside with Tyreek Hill. If there's a player in tier 3 who could finish as a top 5 wide receiver, to me, it's pretty obviously Tyreek Hill. He's done it multiple times in the past, but just so many red flags here, from age-based regression to some minor injuries last year to the fact that his quarterback is maybe the most injury-prone quarterback in the NFL. Enough warning signs that I couldn't really justify pushing Tyreek Hill much higher. All right, as we move on to tier 4, a lot of guys in this tier that I enjoy drafting this season. Not too many stayaways here. So we're looking at T. Higgins, Marvin Harrison Jr., Devontae Adams, Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, and Cortland Sutton. Look, I really like T. Higgins. I think he might be being a little bit overdrafted, just asking that Bengals offense to sustain, 2 of the 15 best receivers in fantasy football. T. Higgins has a ton of injuries in the past and feels like you can always pencil him in for at least 2 or 3 missed games. So love the player, love the talent. Not a name I'll necessarily be clicking on a ton this season. Marvin Harrison Jr., it feels like you got to pick one side or the other. You either love him or you hate him. I'm inclined to believe that we'll see a step forward in year 2. So he was an easy pick for me near the top of tier 4. Devontae Adams, we know who he is at this point in his career. Maybe we do start to see a little bit of physical regression from him. He is the number 2 to Puka Nacua, but also not sure we can count on Nacua to play 17 games. So I think there'll be a handful of weeks where Devontae Adams is the guy for Matthew Stafford. And that Rams team, by the way, badly needs a red zone target. Matthew Stafford, one of the most inefficient quarterbacks in the red zone last season. So I think we have plenty of touchdown potential for Devontae Adams in LA. Terry McLaurin, kind of in a holding pattern right now. I do think the contract situation ends up being worked out. I don't really know what the pivot is for Washington. They can't afford to not have Terry McLaurin on the field. So maybe they have to pay him a little bit more than they would like. Maybe they have to tack on an extra year that they don't feel great about, but I think he's going to be back in Washington. And then we finish out this tier with DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, and Cortland Sutton. Totally fine with Moore, Metcalf, and Sutton. Evans is the guy I have a little bit lower than consensus this season. I know it's been 11 straight 1,000-yard seasons, but there's just not a whole lot of precedent for guys putting up 1,000+ yards in their 12th NFL season. I believe only 11 players have done it since the year 2000. It happens every now and then. Mike Evans' track record implies that maybe he joins that club, but I would rather be out on Mike Evans slightly too early than, draft him with the 38th overall pick and take a loss this season. So expecting some regression for Mike Evans. As we get into tier 5, we have another really interesting group here, and we start with Chris Godwin. Look, if I'm out on Mike Evans, there has to be some sort of push and pull here. I am in on Chris Godwin at cost. We saw a much different version, by the way, of Mike Evans when Chris Godwin was healthy. A guy who was basically only being targeted 6-7 times per game at about 4 catches for 45 yards per game before Chris Godwin went down. It really wasn't until that injury that Mike Evans had to step up. So I'm taking an optimistic viewpoint on Chris Godwin. He's coming back from a very severe injury, but it was a bone injury. It wasn't a ligament injury. He didn't tear his ACL. He's not coming back from an Achilles. I think he's going to be back, if not for week 1, within the first couple of weeks of the season. And I'm pretty confident he can hit the ground running. Xavier Worthy, had to move him up a little bit within this tier, given the Rashee Rice news. We'll talk a little bit more about him in just a moment. We got Jamison Williams. We still have Rashee Rice in this tier. Again, I'm recording this video like 6 hours after the Rashee Rice news came out. We have no idea how many games he's going to miss, but it does feel like a certainty that a suspension is coming. Will it be 3 games, 4, 5, 6? Who knows? If it's 6 games, we're moving him further down, but not going to make that move until we have a definitive ruling from the NFL. He was somebody I was plenty comfortable taking in the second round prior to that news on July 17th. Also in this tier, we got Jamison Williams, Devontae Smith, Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Tet McMillan, and Jalen Waddle. You know, Devontae Smith, about as rock solid as it gets. I think it's clear now that there is a ceiling on his fantasy production, you know, partially given his frame, partially given the offense in which he plays, but never somebody that you really worry too much about. Zay Flowers, I'm fine with. I don't love him this season. You know, I think the fact that he only ended up with 4 receiving touchdowns last year in a year when Lamar threw for 41, that's a little bit concerning. Was 4th on his own team in terms of red zone targets. Obviously, they have the 2 tight ends plus Rashad Bateman. Talked a little bit about George Pickens earlier. I'm still in on him. I like both him and CeeDee Lamb as long as Dak is healthy. And McMillan and Waddle, those are kind of the wild cards here, right? I mean, Tet McMillan could be great. I could see him stumbling in Carolina. A lot of that depends on what you expect from Bryce Young this season. And Jalen Waddle, same case for Tyreek Hill, just not as much upside, right? He's tethered to Tua. He has to stay healthy. Both of those have been issues in the past. All right, we got 2 more tiers, tier 6 and tier 7. This is a very deep position, of course, in fantasy football. Oftentimes you're starting 3 receivers. Maybe you're throwing one in your flex. So I want to hit some more names here. Tier 6, this is a big one for me. We got 15 players in tier 6. I'm totally fine if you want to divide these into a couple of tiers, but I do view a lot of these guys relatively equally. So we got Jacoby Myers, Josh Downs, Jerry Jeudy, Rome Odunze, Calvin Ridley, Chris Olave, Jawan Jennings, Travis Hunter, Ricky Pearsall, Jaden Reed, Jordan Addison, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Khalil Shakir, and Stephon Diggs. You'll notice I said Jacoby Myers' name first. I am a Jacoby Myers supporter. I'm a Jacoby Myers guy. All this guy does is beat his ADP every single year. He now has arguably, maybe inarguably, the best quarterback that he's ever played with in Geno Smith. I know we expect this to be a very run-heavy offense in Vegas, but I think they could still make room for Jacoby Myers to once again beat his ADP, currently going as the wide receiver 39. If I'm betting on a receiver in Indy, it's going to be Josh Downs. I think he's the most talented receiver on that roster. I think we kind of saw Michael Pittman get exposed a little bit last season. I know injuries were part of the equation for him, but if I'm betting on one of those guys to have a top 25 even wide receiver season, it's going to be Josh Downs. You know, picking out some other names from this tier, I'm not really in on Chris Olave. I worry a ton about the concussions. I worry a ton about the quarterback situation. You know, I think that can end up benefiting Alvin Kamara in a roundabout way. We see a lot of checkdowns. We see a lot of conservative play from the Saints. I don't know that that's going to benefit Chris Olave. Good luck sorting out the 49ers. You know, I'm drafting more Ricky Pearsall than Jawan Jennings, mostly staying away from Brandon Ayuk, but do recognize the upside there. Just feels like every week we get some sort of development that completely shakes up how you rank those 3, but I got them all within this tier. Khalil Shakir is somebody that I do like. I kind of wish I would have moved him up a little bit higher within this tier, but at the same time, I think they want Keon Coleman to potentially be the guy this season in Buffalo, and I couldn't quite squeeze him into this tier. We do have him in tier 7, but I think what we saw from Khalil Shakir, I'd be surprised if he tops that in 2025, and then did get Stephon Diggs in here. Look, I don't know what's going on with this offseason for Stephon Diggs. He's coming back from an injury, but there's not a whole lot of competition in New England. I'm a little bit tepid on the Patriots. I wouldn't bet the over on that 8.5 win total, but look, the Pats have their supporters. Mike Vrabel maximizes talent, and if the Patriots do hit in the way that a lot of people think they can, it's hard to imagine Stephon Diggs not being a big part of that. One final tier, tier 7. We got 10 more names I want to mention. We'll go through these quickly. Cooper Kupp, Michael Pittman. Again, hard to believe we were taking him in the 3rd round last year. Darnell Mooney, Keon Coleman, Matthew Golden, Jaden Higgins, Emeka Ibuka, Marvin Mims, Christian Kirk, and Rashad Bateman. Again, with Cooper Kupp, respect the talent. Just to me, not a ton of upside. I think he is kind of past the point of hoping for, you know, some sort of comeback to where this guy was 3 or 4 years ago. He's clearly the number 2 now in Seattle. Wouldn't project him to play more than 12 or 13 games. I do like Darnell Mooney quite a bit. I think he's one of the better late round values at the position. Again, expect this Atlanta offense to be much better with Michael Penix. Certainly think they could support an elite receiver in Drake London and then a nice secondary option in Mooney. Just talked about Keon Coleman. He's somebody I think we could see take a big step forward this season. Matthew Golden in Green Bay, we'll see. Nobody was targeted more than 76 times for the Packers last year. That was Dontavian Wicks. They take this kind of egalitarian approach in that pass catching room. So I'm high on Matthew Golden long term, not necessarily high on him in terms of rookie season production. I do like Jaden Higgins quite a bit if you're throwing darts at the receiver position. I think he opens the year as the wide receiver 3. We'll see if he can eventually overtake Christian Kirk. Emeka Egbuka, we got to respect the fact that he's a first-round pick, certainly a first-round talent, great player at Ohio State. Might be opening the year as a wide receiver 4 in Tampa Bay. Probably needs an injury, maybe 2, to really, really be fantasy effective. So I had to bury him a bit. And then Rashad Bateman, you had to include him in this tier. I'm actually surprised he hasn't been drafted a little bit higher based on what we saw last season, but would expect a little bit of regression. Some splash games last year, some touchdowns that I don't know if we can count on year over year, but is still the number 2 receiver in that offense. But of course, it runs through Lamar. It runs through Derrick Henry on the ground. You got 2 really good tight ends and Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. So yes, he's the wide receiver 2, but at times kind of feels like he's the 3rd or 4th option within that passing game.